Out of every games developer on the planet, BioWare continues to be my favorite. They put out games that have given me more to think about than any other RPG on the planet. I've loved their games since I was a little egg playing Baldur's Gate for the first time. They were my respite in an unhappy childhood, and they were the reason I've been so enamored with character-based storytelling. I think to an extent BioWare is the reason I get so irritated by the story in most other video games, because most of BioWare's catalog is so good and defines so many of my tastes that going from the emotionally fraught adventures of one woman's quest to defy what she is, like an underrated Star Trek villain, and then moving from that into the world being eaten by Yggdrasil's aphid infection always feels like a step down. BioWare pioneered a particular form of character-based drama in RPGs that few developers have ever managed to really compete with, putting those characters front and center and then making them a core aspect of the main plot and larger-scale drama. In recent years, it's been common to claim that they've fallen off because of Mass Effect Andromeda or Anthem, and I object to that on two fronts. One, everyone loved Baldur's Gate 3, which was a BioWare game filtered through fanfiction-level porn writing, and two, this is not the first time BioWare's been in a slump. BioWare has certainly released some duds in the past, like Tales of the Sword Coast, the expansion to Baldur's Gate 1 that added a bunch of side quests with no real campaign to them, essentially a glorified mission pack for full price. Then there was Neverwinter Nights, a completely bare-bones engine framework intended for people to create their own modules and was about as enjoyable as pounding nails into your face. And then there was Jade Empire, a collection of kung fu movie tropes that most people actually forget about until someone else mentions it. And then there's the biggest dud of all, a dud that's not only disappointing at every scale, but had the misfortune to release alongside one of, if not the, greatest RPGs ever made. I'm speaking, of course, of Dragon Age. Dragon Age has always been the redheaded stepchild of the BioWare RPG family, always hanging around and never really being as well regarded as all of its siblings. What with their massive critical acclaim and earned position as iconic moments in video game history, Dragon Age is usually just met with a, oh yeah, that's right, you're here. I feel it's probably because, unlike BioWare's other duds, Dragon Age has somehow managed to sell well enough to stick around. Nobody remembers Neverwinter Nights or Jade Empire, and BioWare would rather you didn't. But Dragon Age keeps sticking around, keeping up with Mass Effect like two weirdly enmeshed siblings. Dragon Age and Mass Effect seem to both come about with the same mindset. Take a classic BioWare RPG that ended up getting taken away from them by rights-holding shenanigans and remake them into something original that would be theirs forever. The problem is that while mechanically and in presentation, Mass Effect was similar to Knights of the Old Republic, narratively it took a lot of inspiration from 70s-era paperback science fiction and 90s-era science fiction serials, in the same way the original Baldur's Gate heavily leaned on R.A. Salvatore, giving it a more unique and personal flair than just a D&D game. And it also had the benefit that you likely hadn't seen or read any of the things it was taking inspiration from. Dragon Age, on the other hand, while lifting some gameplay elements from Baldur's Gate, just smashed together a generic fantasy setting lifted from Lord of the Rings and then stopped there. You got elves, dwarves, mages, you got the usual smatterings of internal fantasy racism, you got the armies of Mordor banging down your front door. It's just Lord of the Rings doused in classic 360-era brown. The only real difference seems to be that it draws on Tolkien a lot, yet simultaneously keeps trying to be the gritty and mature version of it, like Game of Thrones. Exactly like Game of Thrones, actually. Dragon Age's problems are numerous. Some are limited to only one game, and others are series-wide. The franchise has had an identity crisis since it began, trying to reinvent Infinity Engine games at first and doing it terribly, before going in a more action-oriented direction in each subsequent game. It recycles characters between games, but never the good or fun ones, and with the exception of the last one, they all try to carry a cohesive plot between them like Mass Effect does, yet constantly switch the lead character around so you have to get reintroduced to Varric 3 times. But Dragon Age's core problem, the problem that all the other problems spawn from, has always been that it's actually two different stories. The first one is a traditional save the world from the armies of Mordor plot with the evil Darkspawn, a bestial and feral army controlled by some nefarious archdemon, swarming the land to destroy the world, and only you and the Grey Wardens can stop them by raising a last alliance of men and elves to fight together on the slopes of Mount Doom. The second involves systemic bigotry, racism, and genocide being committed by the human kingdom of Ferelden and its lead church, the Chantry, against the Elven people, the Dalish clans, and anyone with the misfortune to be born a mage. This part of the story could serve all kinds of different games on its own. The history of Thedas is racism on top of more racism. The Blights are a comparatively small piece of it. You go through the backstory and the Blight barely gets a passing mention, while the sheer fuckery the human kingdoms inflicted upon the elves, destroying their culture, enslaving them, and then leaving them to rot in ghettos, while the Dalish are routinely hunted and whittled away in a frightening mirror to how North America treats its displaced and tribal indigenous people, takes up the majority of the world building. And yet, Dragon Age, across 3 out of 4 games, tries its best to avoid addressing it wherever possible. The bigotry and systemic rot of the human kingdoms and churches is secondary to the big dark evil horde washing over the land, who are so universally and completely evil that we can wipe them out with impunity. How convenient that this didn't turn out to be a fabrication by human kingdoms. Dragon Age is one of the rare fantasy games with world building is actually quite interesting. What tends to kill the world building of most fantasy games is that it's usually about the gods and the cosmic shenanigans that make mortals look like puny ants and is so far removed from the perspective of a new player that it ends up not being worth caring about. Dragon Age, meanwhile, opens like, hey, you're an elf. You people used to be enslaved to the humans and now you're technically free, but you live in a fucking ghetto. Fucking hell, Dragon Age, way to set the scene. The first thing you learn is the political and social situation of the kingdom you're living in, namely that you are at the very bottom of it. It's like several hours before you learn who the Maker even is, or that monotheism is the order of the day. The first thing you learn about the world of Dragon Age is stuff that is immediately relevant to you. I assume something similar happens for every other origin. I wouldn't know, because playing a human in Dragon Age is like playing Mass Effect as a collector. The first thing that happens in the game is you get abducted from your arranged marriage to be the state-sanctioned rape victims for a human nobles party. But just as the guards are about to strip you down, your friend breaks in and throws you a sword.
Oh, sod.
I am the righteous hand of God. I am the devil that you forgot.
So Dragon Age opens with establishing you as part of a horribly oppressed underclass, then hands you a sword and says, go crazy. This is, unironically, the greatest opening to a video game ever. And the dialogue options make it clear, Kallian has been waiting for this moment her entire life. She's practically daring them to try something, cuts them up like a holiday turkey, kills Inaral's son, and then walks back home with her beloved cousin like nothing happened. Goddamn, Dragon Age, this is fucking wild. When do we rise up in revolution? Turns out never. The instant you get out of the introduction, you're ferried onto the main plot, which is utterly disconnected from what you've just been doing. In fact, it's all disappointingly tame. We go from an admittedly quite dark situation amidst a well-deserved elven uprising to fighting against the forces of Mordor with the power of friendship, I mean legally mandated contracts. I can't help but feel a touch tonally confused. I was really liking that story and now it's just over? Oh man, this isn't good or bad, it's just weird. I've always thought it was weird when a story changes gears so abruptly, but even more so when you spend the first hour doing something really interesting. I want to help my friends in the alienage and kill more Shem. They're living in a ghetto, why aren't I doing anything about that? When did anyone ask for an archdemon? This doesn't ease up in the slightest as you continue. After the first stage at Ostagar, you're given the task to unite Redcliffe, Denerim, the Circle of Mages, and the Dalish Elves to raise an army against the archdemon. I always start with the Circle because there's free stat points there. Now, if you've never played Dragon Age before, you probably hear Circle of Mages and think of a very distinguished order of wizards working together to keep the world safe, like the wizards in Lord of the Rings or the Kirin Tor. When you get there, you see a big mage tower in the distance. Damn, look how opulent that is. That must be an important place where mages congregate. No, actually. See, in Dragon Age, mages are an even underclass who are kept under permanent imprisonment by a very autocratic, violent organization of paladins, and when you get there, he had just given the order to wipe out every mage in the tower, which is completely within his legal right to do. Yeah, Fifth Blight, I'm gonna have to put you on hold. I have to deal with Mage Danek over here. The Circle of Mages is a whole issue in Dragon Age lore, but it's an issue that happens in the margins, and it's one that Dragon Age keeps trying to make into a debatable situation in spite of the fact that it's not. The Templars' reasoning for imprisoning mages is that magic left unchecked can be corrupted by demons from the Fade, turning mages into abominations, which is why apostates, as they call them, can't be left unchecked. However, in the vast majority of cases in the series, all mages who end up becoming abominations are usually Circle mages who have done so out of desperation to escape the magic slavery death camp. Even in the second game, when the Rite of Annulment is called, the only mages who become abominations are the ones trying to, like, not die, or the ones escaping the Circle earlier in the game. You can play as a mage and literally no demons can actually take hold of you unless you let them. You can even do the horrible taboo blood magic and nothing bad happens. I wonder, could the vulnerability to demons possibly be because the demons are offering them the power to escape the death camp? When you actually get there, you can't express any kind of outrage about this, even though I'm an elf, someone who is already treated like shit by the Chantry, and here it's just begrudging support. At no point are you allowed to call this what it is. Genocide. The most you get to do is spare the mages the Rite of Annulment by simply finding the first enchanter, at which point the knights are like, alright, fine, I guess you can live. For now. Now, you could argue, okay, Lily, these are massive institutions and you're just one Grey Warden. You can't change them completely on your own. While you are technically correct, we are supposed to be able to at least plant the seeds of change. Yet instead, we breeze past all of these issues because there's a fucking demon horde on the horizon. There's this ever-present feeling of, oh, don't think about that, focus on fighting the Darkspawn. Then why did you bring it up, Dragon Age? This is a problem because Dragon Age weirdly sets up an extremely oppressive and violent status quo and expects you to just be okay with that. Like, it's just a of vibe. But good storytelling almost never sides with the authoritarian, because independence and the sense to question authority are traditionally heroic qualities. If you think it gets better later, only marginally. Moving on to the Dalish elves, they're embroiled in a struggle that's decades in the making. The Dalish were here before, but were set upon by a camp of demons who kidnapped their leader's son and daughter. They tortured the son and killed him, and then raped the daughter and left her for dead. When she found out she was pregnant, she committed suicide. Enraged by all of this, the leader cursed the humans to take the form they truly represent: beasts. Mindless, violent, feral beasts. And when you get there, the werewolves are attacking the Dalish in retaliation, and their leader sends you to kill Witherfang so he can cure his people who have contracted lycanthropy. After a long dungeon, you meet Witherfang, who wants you to convince the elven leader to break the curse, because the people who did this crime are long dead. Must the descendants suffer the sins of their fathers? I need to point this out, this is the best Origins has to offer in terms of weighing a conflict. Yeah, we tortured and raped some children, but that was like a while ago. This is treated like an isolated problem, an act of individual violence. Yet the perpetrators of that violence lived in a system that encouraged them to behave this way. The Dalish are always under the threat of violence from humans. Am I or them expected to believe this time it'll be different because these ones spent some time as wolves? This isn't even the first time humans raping elves because they can get away with it has happened in this game. Furthermore, why is an example of long-standing systemic violence being used for a Sins of the Father plot? It's not like they're doing anything different. They're still attacking and killing elves outright, not doing much to tell me that you only want peace. So I killed all of them. I felt almost insulted that the game expected me to go for the fucking neutral option. Ironically, Origin's problem is that it does its world building too well. The City Elf Origin puts you in the mindset of someone who has just been empowered to take out their anger on their oppressor, and that at all stages expects me not to do that. And I got way too into the headspace of Kallian herself, to the point that outside of Morrigan, I was utterly disinterested in the troubles of my mostly human companions. No, I'm not listening to your fucking problems, Alistair. You exist to get stabbed in my place. Talk about the Chantry one more time, original character Do Not Steal, and I'm gonna pull your tongue out through your nose. But with all of that, you can at least see the nucleus of an idea forming somewhere deep in the bowels of the plot. You know, I can understand if you responded to all of this with, "You're just refusing to engage with the story on its terms." But I would argue that its terms are unreasonable. But it's the rest of the game that really tells me that Origins had no intention of taking these issues seriously. When you reach the depths of the Deep Roads, you learn that the Darkspawn have what's called broodmothers. How are they made? Simple. Women are taken from Darkspawn raids, then they're forced to eat each other. Then the Darkspawn vomit down their throats. Then they're raped repeatedly for some reason, and this twists and morphs and corrupts them until they become this thing. You know, on paper, that's horrifying, but when you have to see it play out in front of you, it's so over-the-top gruesome that I feel like I'm watching llamas with hats. This is Dragon Age's equivalent of the dog girl from Full Metal Alchemist. It's so edgy and so dark that you just stop being able to take it seriously. You just have to stand back and laugh because what fucking 14-year-old thought of this? You just established that Thetis' lore has underworld demon marathon rape corruption magic vomit inflation. This is just fucking silly. No, the actually horrifying thing happens afterward. These dwarves are only being subjected to this because their leader, Branka, allowed it to happen to them so she would have a limitless supply of test subjects. One of them is her wife, who she just abandons in there. That woman's only crime was falling in love with the wrong person. You go there looking for Branka to settle a royalty dispute, but when you get there, she's just vile. And the conclusion we draw from all of this is that she went mad with ambition. This isn't good. It's so utterly bleak and miserable and mean and callous, and with nothing to say. It's all edge and no point. It is utterly without thought or consideration or wisdom to offer. It's the RPG equivalent of the fucking Dominion War, piling on the bodies and gore and misery without any thought toward what any of it is supposed to mean. Out of every main quest in the game, Orzammar is just completely and utterly unpleasant. It's a long, tedious, grueling slog, and the closer you get to the end, the more and more I just want to pack up and leave. This video almost died here because before recording for this video, I played this game to completion exactly once, and the thought of doing Orzammar again filled me with dread. At least in the opening I can kill some fucking Shem. At least in the Dalish quest I can kill some more Shem. This is 2 hours of mind-numbing Darkspawn fights to find a character that is so over-the-top evil that she just makes me feel numb. Like the high fantasy equivalent of this bitch. People will often defend this by saying this is dark fantasy, but it's really not. Dark fantasy is a term that means fantasy horror, and Dragon Age is not that. It's high fantasy with some racism and genocide tacked on. But the thing about dark storytelling as a concept is that a dark story is more than just blood, gore, and rape. A dark story has something to say, and it says it in a way that is neither cathartic nor reassuring. At the same time I was working on this video, I have been working on another video about Star Trek Voyager. Of the TNG-era Trek series, Voyager is the darkest of the three. Most people wouldn't believe that because Voyager can be very lighthearted when it wants to be, but a lot of episodes of Voyager deal with issues that are especially grim and difficult, and it tackles ethical questions that Next Generation or DS9 would have never had the guts to tackle. And more to that point, it often comes away with a non-reassuring answer. Take the episode Tuvix, arguably the darkest episode of Star Trek in history. People debate whether or not Janeway committed murder by separating Tuvix, but the show doesn't. Nobody ever once contests that this is murder. Janeway committed murder. She's even visibly affected by it at the very end. It's not just a very harsh thing to think about, you also don't get the comfort of the main character affirming your feelings. You have to sit there with it and think about it, and people have. Oftentimes, Voyager asks an ethical question, Janeway will take a potential answer, and the audience is left to sit and think about that. And it can make a lot of people very uncomfortable. There's a reason, aside from the usual undercurrent of misogyny, that Janeway is such a contentious character. Her priorities as a character often don't line up with the priorities of a centrist, center-left viewer. This is what dark themes looks like. Dark themes are not, this person went mad with ambition and let their lover get raped by zombies. Oh well, time to go to the Landsmeet. This is just edgy for the sake of edgy. I don't blame anyone who, when Dragon Age came out, thought it was a dark and mature fantasy game that could be held above all the others. You were a teenager. You probably thought the same thing about Postal 2. Ironically, the darkest thing in Origins isn't any of the performatively edgy shit. It's actually the Urn of Sacred Ashes. The urn is the final resting place for Andraste, the champion and lover of the Maker, the human's fictitious god. Andraste's life is bleak. Ultimately, she spent much of her life as a slave to the Tevinter, a comically evil nation that would have put the Krenim Imperium to shame. What's with the Star Trek references today? She later fought against the Tevinter, actively fighting against slavery in Thetis, and she was ultimately captured and burned at the stake. The religion that formed around her now has absurd amounts of power, and yet it is complacent in the slavery and genocide of Thetis. In the case of mages, they aren't just complacent, they are complicit. And Andraste is held up as this mythical figure by an organization that spits on everything she ever believed. You, the player, find her urn to take a pinch of the ashes to help cure an Arl who you need to fight the Blight. You're assisted by a Chantry monk, and after confirming the urn does indeed exist, he wants to reveal its location to the Chantry so people can make pilgrimages to it, people can take pinches of the ashes, and the Chantry's influence can grow. Now, the Chantry is an awful organization that already spat on their own prophet's name many times, but the thought that they would defile their own prophet's grave in such a way just to turn it into an altar to make pilgrimages to, and that it would be so eagerly exploited was disgusting. I felt genuine sympathy for Andraste, not as a mythical figure, but as just a person who shouldn't have her grave desecrated like this, especially not by her own worshippers. What does that say about the Chantry as an organization, that they would choose their own power and influence over respecting the wishes of their own deity, actively destroying their remains just so they can cloy for a little more power? Like, damn, that is dark. So I killed him. This was another point where my origin played a factor here. Kallian's an elf. She doesn't believe in the Maker. Andraste's just a person whose ashes have been influenced by lyrium. But she's a person who did more than most. She actively fought against slavery. She's a person who deserves better than to be a prop for this awful church. This has such a greater impact because I can actually do something about it and settle the issue now. It's not much in the grand scheme of things, just keeping one grave from being defiled, but it's a decision with more lasting implications and consequences than anything else in the game. You are actively defying the Chantry, actively reducing their power. Dragon Age has a lot of Dominion wars, a lot of violence and elves turning up dead in gutters and state-sanctioned rape squads, and at every point the game does its best to divert your attention away to its version of the Dominion. The evil thing on the horizon. Look at the big fight, look at the big ogre, look at the explosion. But it has very few Tuvix, very few occasions where the game makes a salient thematic point and forces you to sit there with it, which is the whole reason you put things like this in a game in the first place. To the game's credit, after you finish all the main quests, before you take your armies to fight the Darkspawn, you have to deal with the trouble in the alienage. Tevinter mages have set up a hospice claiming the elves have a blight-borne disease. In reality, they're incarcerating people and sending them off to be enslaved. And here, at least, we get to mostly end the game the exact same way we started, killing Shem bastards who think they can walk into the neighborhood and hurt your family.
I am the righteous hand of God. I am the devil that you forgot. And I told you one day you will see that I'll be back, I guarantee. And that hell's coming.
I don't suppose you would consider just letting me go.
Hell's coming with me.
BioWare wanted to make a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate, but with swearing and racism and gore and rape and all that grown-up shit, the mage death camps and the elven ghettos and the slavery are just an aesthetic. They were never a part of the game's theme. It was just a traditional heroic fantasy set in a bleak, dark world where everything is horrible and nothing gets better, and actively wanting it to get better was going to be an exercise in futility, because that made it more realistic, I guess. And at the very end, all you can really do is politely ask the new king to treat your people better. Lily, it sounds like you don't even want anything to think about. You wanted the game to be Django Unchained, but with elves. Well, I can't deny that would have been fun, but in all seriousness, I'll take either let's really think about the implications and systems at play in this kind of oppression, or I count two guns, fucker. But the problem with Dragon Age Origins is that it's neither. It's Warhammer, a world filled with comically over-the-top racism, and you're not actually supposed to engage with it beyond picking up a torch and cross and giddily joining the fray. And all that misery was outclassed in not just how bleak Thedas is, but in emotional significance by simply not allowing a grave to be turned into a political prop, because it's a small act of kindness in an otherwise unfeeling world. And this is something we're going to revisit in the next video, because I feel Dragon Age 2 pulls this part off masterfully. But we'll discuss that next time. I'm Lily, and thank you for watching.
And it is well with my soul. You line your pockets full of money that you steal from